Shalom Avracha from Yerushalayim, Ir HaKodesh. This evening we are privileged to study together the Haftarah of Acharei Mot Kedoshim. We read in the synagogues here in Eretz Yisrael this week the two sections of Acharei Mot Kedoshim, and we would like together to try to study the prophetic section associated with them. I'd just like to mention that tonight is Yom HaZikaron. Tonight is the Memorial Day for all those fallen soldiers, for all those victims of terror. And when I was preparing to speak about the two sections that we read this Shabbat, it occurred to me that both names seem to properly apply to the mode of this evening. Acharei Mot, which means after the death, and Kedoshim. We're talking about the holiest people in the world who were killed for no other reason except that they were part of Am Yisrael. So that I hope that our study this evening will be as a commemoration and as an elevation for the souls of all the fallen. Acharei Mot Kedoshim. In fact, there's a tradition in the Zohar, in the Ari, in Kabbalistic literature. Acharei Mot begins with a description about God speaking to Moshe after the death of the children of Aharon. In the Zohar, in Kabbalah, there's this teaching about the people who cry over the death of Aharon's children. A special reward will be brought upon them. Tonight is a night where the whole nation of Israel here is all crying, and memorial services all over. And may the Acharei Mot Kedoshim study bring special levels of blessing to all of Am Yisrael. The question is, which is not usually a question, but is a question this evening, generally speaking, when there are two sections of Torah, when we read two portions of Torah together, there is a rule that's been well established in our tradition that you always read the Haftarah of, anyone? The first or the second?
Second.
The second Parshat, yes. You always read the Haftarah of the second Parshat. That's a rule that's established in Shulchan Aruch. If you're interested, it's in Siman Taf Kaf Het, in Seif Het in the Ramah, and I quote, Ukishekorin Shtei Parshiyot Maftirin Ba'aharona. You always read the Haftarah connected to the second section. That's generally the rule. When there are two Torah scrolls, we read the Haftarah connected to the reading of the second. If there are three Torah scrolls, we read the Haftarah connected to the third reading. I guess since that's the concluding section, the Haftarah follows that. And therefore, when there are two Parshiyot, we read the Haftarah. Let's say a Parsha A and Parsha B joined together, which can happen on many occasions during the year. Let's say Tazriya Mitzorah. When Tazriya Mitzorah, we spoke about those sections last week. When Tazriya and Mitzorah together. This year it didn't apply because it was the day before Rosh Chodesh. But let's say when Tazriya and Mitzorah together, there's a Haftarah of Tazriya and there's a Haftarah of Mitzorah. The rule is you would read the Haftarah of Mitzorah. You don't read two, you read one. You always read the one connected to the second section. In Shulchan Aruch, in the Code of Jewish Law, it says that there's one exception to this rule. And the exception is Acharei Mot Kedoshim, yes. Chutz milvad ba'Acharei Mot Kedoshim, with the exception of the Haftarot, with the exception of the prophetic readings of the two portions which we're about to read this week in the synagogue, that we read the Haftarah of Parashat Acharei Mot, and we do not read the Haftarah of Parashat Kedoshim, explains the Mishnah Brura. If you're interested, it's Saif Katan Kavav in the Mishnah Brura on Siman Tav Kafchet, because we prefer to read the reading of Acharei Mot, because the Haftarah of the second section, the Haftarah of Kedoshim, is taken from the 22nd chapter of Ezekiel, and the 22nd chapter of Ezekiel speaks about the abominations of Jerusalem. There's a long list there of, he refers to Yerushalayim, those people following in the text. Ezekiel 22, he refers to Yerushalayim as the city of bloodshed. And if you look at sentence 3, it speaks about how they spill blood, they shed blood in the city, and they're involved in idolatry in the city. And if you look at sentence 7, it speaks about their lack of regard for parents, and their slanderous. Sentence 8 speaks of, defilement of the sacred and defilement of Shabbat. Sentence 9 speaks of the abomination of slanderous speech. Sentences 10 and 11 speak about sexual transgressions, forms of adultery. Sentence 12 there speaks about taking bribes. So the rabbi said, if you have a choice, even though Kedoshim, the reason why it would be parallel to Kedoshim, because Kedoshim discusses many violations of Torah, we don't want to read about the abominations of Yerushalayim. So if we can, we prefer to read from the prophet Amos, which is the Haftarah of Acharei Mot, the last chapter of Amos, the last chapter of the book of Amos. That's chapter 9 of Amos. And even though it goes against the rules, that's the way we follow, and that's the custom. Let's follow in almost all communities. This coming Shabbat, to study the book of Amos, to read the book of Amos, rather than to read the book of Ezekiel. Now there is a discussion in the Talmud where Rabbi Eliezer says in Tractate Megillah, he says, we do not want to read ever. We never want to read about the sections of the prophet that speak about the abominations or the atrocities of Yerushalayim. That's not for public reading. Yes, we have to study the book of Ezekiel. Yes, we have to be aware of the imperfections of Jerusalem. Yes, we have to study the transgressions of the people, but not as a public reading. So Rabbi Eliezer ruled, if you're interested, Tractate Megillah, page 25. Rabbi Eliezer ruled, we do not read Ein Maftirin, says Rabbi Eliezer. We do not read the Haftarah of Hodah at Yerushalayim. You do not read any prophetic sections that deal with informing Jerusalem about its misdeeds. And then they tell a story in the Talmud. And the story is recorded in the Babylonian Talmud. It's recorded in the Eretz Yisrael Talmud, known as Talmud Yerushalmi. It's recorded in Masechet Sofrim, several places. We have reference to this story. Ma'aseh. It happened once. Ba'adam ehad shahaya korei l'malam Rabbi Eliezer. There was one person who was reading the Haftarah in the community, in the synagogue, in the study hall of Rabbi Eliezer. Now, in the earlier times, today everything is well established. We have a chart of exactly which section of the prophets you read. In the earlier period, it was more fluid. It was up to the person who was called up, the person who was going to be reading it. They could choose one of several sections. And this particular person decided he's going to read the section about the abominations of Yerushalayim. So Rabbi Eliezer, Ma'aseh b'adam echad sheyakorei l'maleh, Rabbi Eliezer hodah et Yerushalayim et to'avoteha. You read the section. You read the section from the book of Ezekiel about the transgressions of Yerushalayim. The 16th chapter speaks about that. 22nd chapter speaks of several places in Ezekiel. And Rabbi Eliezer approached him afterwards and he said, instead of speaking about the abominations of Yerushalayim, instead of investigating the abominations of Yerushalayim, maybe you should investigate the abominations of your own personal family. Ad she'ata bodek b'to'avot Yerushalayim, tzei u'bedok b'to'avot immecha. Rather than examining and exploring the abominations of Yerushalayim, go and examine the abominations of your family. And at least in two of the three sources, in the Talmud Bavli, it says the students investigated and they found there was some kind of problematic aspect with his lineage. In the Talmud Yerushalmi, in Masechet Sofrim, it says that they actually found him to be an illegitimate child. That the person reading, about the abominations, was himself a product of of an abomination. You know? I don't know what this means. The language in the language of the Yerushalmi is v'nimtza mamzer. He had the legal status of a bastard, of an illegitimate child. You know, I don't know what this means. How Rabbi Eliezer saw this. Maybe if you're overemphasizing other people's imperfections, you know, if you what you like to speak about is they did this wrong and they did that wrong, and they're disgusting in this area of behavior and disgusting in that area of behavior. Very often, kol haposel b'mumo posel. Roughly translated, it means when you're constantly pointing out imperfections in other people. Very often, it's really a self-reflective kind of statement. Maybe really what you're doing is speaking about yourself. And I remember about 15 years ago in Yerushalayim, there was this question because it's rare. It only happens once, maybe once in 20 years or so, where we had the sections of Acharei Mot and Kedoshim read separately. Then almost every year we read it together. And there was no other Haftarah. In other words, we had to read the section of Acharei Mot, we had to read the section of Kedoshim, and the question is, what do you read for the Haftarah? So some said, well, I mean, the Haftarah of Acharei Mot is Amos, read Amos, and Kedoshim is Yechezkel, read Yechezkel. And others said, and I believe Rabbi Salvation, of blessed memory, at one time had published this also, that the custom was in certain parts of the world that we never read Yechezkel 22. And I think the recorded statement was that in Lita, in Lithuania, they never read this Haftarah. Even if Acharei Mot and Kedoshim were separate sections, we always emphasized the reading of Amos, and we have a little minyan at the Kotel, Baruch Hashem, and had to make a decision, you know. And the custom that we followed those 2 weeks was that on both weeks, I read the same Haftarah. We read Acharei Mot, we read the section of Amos, and the next week people said, "Oh, what are we reading today?" I said, "We're reading Amos." But that's what you read last week. I said, "Yeah, there is such a custom because in some communities it's the Haftarah of Acharei Mot, in some communities it's the Haftarah of Kedoshim. It's rare to read the same Haftarah twice. What's the point?" I was thinking today, you know, that we're so close. Let's say this year, Acharei Mot Kedoshim is just a day or two after the observances of Yom HaAtzmaut, and I was thinking that there are some people, when they reflect upon Yom HaAtzmaut, I respect other people's opinions, but you know, there's some people who love to point out that which is lacking in the country, that which is imperfect, that which is not right, that which is not pure, that which is not. I don't know if that's what you're supposed to do. You know, maybe Yom HaAtzmaut is a time, maybe the Day of Independence, maybe tonight the day of commemoration, the Memorial Day. Maybe today's the day to speak about positive. You know, don't go looking for all the negativity. You can find negativity. Nobody thinks that it's perfect here, but maybe let's go with the Amos mode rather than the Yechezkel mode, and therefore maybe we should read sentence 11 of Amos, talking about chapter 9, where he speaks about how God, it's the Haftarah of this week, Bayom Hahu Akim et Sukkot David Hanofelet, I will restore the falling Sukkah hut of David. I will reestablish, you know, the kingdom of David. Or he writes there in sentence 14, V'shavti et Shavut Ami Yisrael, I will restore the restoration of my people Israel. Or the concluding sentence of the Haftarah, the concluding sentence of the book of Amos, such a beautiful words, may it be fulfilled tonight. It says that God will plant the Jewish people upon their land, and never again will they ever be uprooted from the land. That's the spirit. I mean, that's the spirit we should be speaking about. That's the spirit we should be emphasizing tonight and tomorrow night and on Yom HaAtzmaut and on Shabbat Parshat Acharei Mot Kedoshim. Maybe that's the message. Maybe it's not coincidental that we read this in such close juxtaposition to the observances of Yom HaZikaron, Yom HaAtzmaut, because many of these messages are important to hear these days as well. May we merit to see all the fulfillments of the beautiful prophecies dealing with the future rebuilding of Israel by, as mentioned in the prophet Amos, in the Haftarah of Acharei Mot. And may we never have any need to describe the abominations of Yerushalayim, because Yerushalayim will be perfected to such an extent that nobody will even understand what they're talking about. Any kind of imperfection in Yerushalayim, it'll be such a perfect, holy city with no negativity. Yivarechecha Hashem mitzion, ure'ei b'tuv Yerushalayim, kol yemei chayecha, ure'ei vanim levanecha shalom ha'Yisrael. May we always see the tuv Yerushalayim, the great blessing of Yerushalayim, as we read the Haftarah of Acharei Mot, rather than the Haftarah of Kedoshim. Thank you so much.